You are listening to the Prepared Warrior Podcast, where law enforcement and military trainers discuss cutting-edge training, tactics, and technology. Here is your host, John Wilson.
Welcome to Season 1, Episode 6 of the Prepared Warrior. I'm John Wilson. Our guest for this episode is Philip Law. I like to start every episode with a quote. This one is from Heraclitus, who said, "Out of every 100 men, 10 shouldn't even be there. 80 are just targets, 9 are the real fighters, and we are lucky to have them, for they make the battle. But the one is a warrior, and he will bring the others back." All right, our guest for the show, Philip Law, was a law enforcement officer in Florida for 16 years. He has worked in patrol, street crimes, K-9 unit, drug enforcement unit, and DEA Task Force, as well as being a state-certified instructor. After leaving law enforcement, he worked as a private security contractor for the U.S. State Department and the U.S. Department of Defense for 5 years in the Middle East. He was assigned to a combined Joint Special Operations Task Force as an explosive detection dog handler. Philip currently oversees the operations and training for the Special Operations Teams, K-9 and emergency response teams for the third largest corrections agency in the United States. Thanks so much for coming on the Prepared Warrior podcast.
Thank you, John. I appreciate the opportunity.
Now, before we get into it, I just, the name Philip Law, were you predestined to work in law? Is that go down the family lineage, or?
There is actually, and I've heard that a lot. There's not a lot of law enforcement officers in my direct family, but I like to think that I was destined to do it. Yes.
Yeah, that's just I guess coincidental, lucky name, I guess.
Yes, sir.
Now, you have a diverse background from working private security overseas to being a law enforcement officer, K-9 handler, drug enforcement, and now overseeing training for ERT and K-9 for corrections. Is there a lot of overlap in terms of skills for the various assignments you've been working on?
Yeah, I believe there is a lot of overlap. I've seen a lot, and I think the biggest thing has been a progression of those skills that has always prepared me for the next adventure. Starting out as a young law enforcement officer working, in patrol, at that point in my life, I was not prepared, didn't have the skills to, do what I did in future steps. So each step has kind of been a building block. It's taught me new skills from, like I said, being a patrol deputy to ultimately now overseeing our special operations teams in the about a 24,000 member department. So each step in there has just helped with the progression of skills and taught me the things that I needed to learn to be successful at the next level.
So how did you first make that jump from operations to training? Was there a specific interest at the beginning, or did you just kind of fall into it? Well,
like many people that became instructors, I initially became an instructor again as a young deputy because I wanted to be a firearms instructor because I thought that meant that I would get to shoot a lot more. And as many have found, that is not necessarily the case. You're still going to have to invest your own time and take your own time to do that shooting because you don't have time to do it when you're teaching. So that's why I initially got into training, and then I became more passionate as my career went on. And as I started, saw a couple of my personal friends that were killed in the line of duty. And, as that has progressed, I've become more and more passionate about training. And then, the task that I had working overseas, there was a lot of people that really invested in me while I was over there that were teaching me, how to do the job and how to do the job as safe as you possibly could with the most minimal exposure while still getting the job done. And I felt like because those people invested in me as time went on, that it now became an obligation of mine to take all of those skills that I had learned throughout my career and pour that into other people and anybody that would be willing to listen to me. And in my current position, I'm actually over operations and training for emergency operations and K-9. So I'm constantly switching back and forth between the operational aspect and the training aspect. So there's times that I'm wearing BDUs and I'm running a special teams academy in the shoot house or on the range, or and then the next day I'm wearing a coat and tie and I'm making decisions and determining procedure changes. So it's a constant jumping back and forth between the operations and training. And I think the biggest difference between the two really are, when you're out training, you're focused on a very specific tactics, a very specific task in the realm of what you're teaching, very mission specific in that. And from the operations perspective, you have to be focused on an overall strategy, not just a simple tactic. How each decision when you're running operations, each decision and each moving part affects not only the accomplishment of that mission, but also the legal, the financial, long-term effects of overall operations and the precedent that sets for future operations.
I see. So there's a lot of different, from one specific task to overseeing everyone's tasks. Would you say jumping from those different things kind of keeps you up to date and on your toes on all the different aspects of law enforcement, like operations and training?
Absolutely. I tell people all the time that I probably have the best job in our entire department, simply because I still get to be active and setting training standards and really mentoring and helping new instructors and bringing in new instructors to our special teams. But then I also get to have the operations side of things where I can actually make an impact through procedure changes and making presentations and recommendations to the higher ups in the department. So I am absolutely lucky to have the job that I have, and hope I keep doing it for quite some time.
Has training changed or evolved, would you say, since you first began your career?
Absolutely. I was first exposed to training, when I went through the police academy, and I'm going to date myself a little bit, but 1991, I believe I went through the police academy. So 27 years, there's been a lot of progression in how we train, the topics that need to be trained. And I really think that there's been a couple of impacting factors on that has really pushed training to the next level, from a law enforcement and corrections perspective. And one of those was 9/11. 9/11 had a huge impact on training itself, for several reasons. I think, part of that is because people realized that the wolf was knocking on the door, so to speak, and that they needed to step their game up, and there's new skills that need to be learned, and we have new threats that we have to deal with. And then you look at the current state of events that we're in right now, where we have officers that are intentionally targeted and intentionally ambushed. I also think the availability of quality instructors, the post 9/11 world, having the opportunity to be able to go train with people that are subject matter experts in their field, that have seen human reaction in very high stress situations. There's a lot more of those people available today. And a lot of these people are, after they work overseas, for instance, they end up going to work for a department, and they're able to bring some of that experience back to the department with them. So I think that's probably been the biggest things that have evolved training. However, I do believe there are still some agencies out there that feel as though training is just a necessary evil. And it's just something that they have to check a box and they have to do. And I think we really need to focus on trying to change that, because it's a disservice to the officers, and it's a disservice to the community in general.
How would you describe the current state of law enforcement corrections training? It sounds like you think there's room for improvement, and some people maybe don't take it as seriously as others. I think the overall state of training, I think it's good. I think it's headed in the right direction. And I think people are realizing the importance of that training and how it has a direct impact on the officer. When I first got into law enforcement, for instance, it was, as a law enforcement officer, the day you became a law enforcement officer, you were just supposed to be bigger and badder than everybody that you were dealing with. That was just the mentality. Well, that's everybody's realizing that's not true anymore.
that it takes training, and it takes building up that skill set within those officers in order for them to accomplish their tasks successfully and safely. But I do believe there's probably the one thing that I would say that we really need to focus on as agencies across the country, and that's on the instructors. An agency can have a phenomenal philosophy on training, but the person that came up with that philosophy, whether it be a sheriff or a chief or a department head, they're not going to have a direct impact on every officer in that department and the training that they're going to receive. They're going to get that impact from their instructors. So where I think the agency's focus needs to be is really developing instructors. And I would say, many times we send people to an instructor class, and that qualifies them under whatever jurisdiction runs the training for their state or area that they're in. They go to the instructor class, they come back from it, and they're automatically, you're an instructor, go teach. And I think that if we look at it from a perspective of our agencies, we've had FTO programs, field training programs for officers for quite some time, and they've evolved and they have gotten really good and have some really good programs in place. And I think they're turning out professional and confident officers by the time they hit the beat and it's time for them to do their assigned task. I don't, however, see a lot of those types of programs for our instructors. Almost like a field training program for instructors to give these instructors very clear expectations and then mentor them and coach them through the process of growing as an instructor. And I think that even for seasoned instructors, for instance, a seasoned instructor who may be the best instructor their department has, first off, just because you're an instructor doesn't mean you know everything. And I think instructors need to realize that, and they need to go to other trainings with the specific task of learning how to be a good instructor. It may not necessarily be, it may be a class they're going to that they've already taught that class before. They understand the process or the product inside and out. But they need to go to the class with the intention of learning how to be a better instructor. And even if that they realize that they may disagree with that instructor. They may disagree with a specific tactic that instructor is teaching. I was just myself this week. I went to a patrol rifle instructor class. I've been to multiple patrol rifle instructor classes, but I had the opportunity to go to one, so I went. And what I realized was, even if I may have looked at a very specific tactic and thought, yeah, I don't think that's the best tactic to take back to my people, the way the tactic was presented and the presentation that the instructor gave taught me something. And it taught me that I can present my material the way they just presented that material, and get through to my students better. When I look at the class that I'm sitting around and I see as the instructor teaches this specific tactic and the presentation of that and how they went about doing it, and I saw the look on these people's faces where I knew they got it, I was like, okay, well, I just learned something there, that process. So I think that's where we run into a problem, and I've seen this time and time again, and I'm sure your listeners have probably seen it as well. And it's a process of what I call institutional inbreeding. And it's a process where you have a subject matter expert who is really good at what they do, and they teach an instructor level class. And then those instructors go out and they teach the exact same thing they were taught. I think we all would probably agree that you can sit through a class with a very high level expert instructor, and when you walk away from there, you're not walking away with 100% of what they taught you. You're only picking up pieces of what they taught you. So as you go out and then you start teaching that specific topic, and then as time goes on, now you're the person that's teaching instructors. So you're teaching new instructors based on what you learned, 5, 10, 15 years ago. And what happens over time is that specific topic or that technique starts getting watered down. Instead of, you go to that class with that high level instructor and you learn and you take everything you can and then you study it and then you practice it yourself and you become a subject matter expert on it. And then you look at this ever evolving world that we have around us and new situations that are occurring and new tactics and techniques that are evolving constantly, new products that are coming out, and you continually incorporate that stuff into your training. And that's how I think we continue to deliver high level training. That's how we overall improve the state of our law enforcement and corrections training is for instructors to just really dive into it and really understand that they have a huge obligation to the people that they're teaching, not just to regurgitate information, but to really know what they're talking about. And then the other thing that I see, John, is we have my philosophy, when you look at the new officers that we're hiring these days, the new officers that are coming into our academies these days, they don't necessarily think the way I thought when I went to the academy in 1991. They weren't necessarily raised the exact same way. Not saying that they're bad, just saying they're different. And one of the things that I've seen when I teach at different colleges that I teach at is some of the stuff that they lack the moment they sit down in the classroom is critical thinking, understanding of chain of command, understanding respect and accountability. So I think as an instructor, if I just go into the room and I teach them what's in the book, I have not addressed any of those shortcomings. So as a quality instructor, in my opinion, you should be able to stand up in front of the class and teach that information that's in the book that you're required to teach. But every question that comes up, every example that's given, you're constantly putting it back on the class and you're teaching those skills. You're teaching them to think instead of just giving them the answer and moving on to the next section of the book. Make them give you an answer. And then when they give you that answer, make them explain why they think that's the right answer and why that's the appropriate way to go about doing this. And then you correct them or you praise them or whatever the case may be. But ultimately what that's doing is that's requiring them to make decisions. And then also at the same point in time, you teach the chain of command. You teach respect for that chain of command and the reason for that chain of command. And then ultimately there's accountability for your actions. So I think that's probably one thing that we could make a huge impact on our training currently is if instructors understood that going into it, that they're not teaching the same learning styles that they taught 10 years ago or 15 years ago. It's a different learning style, and there's shortcomings there that we have to address. And whether your academy is 7 weeks or 13 weeks or 6 months or a year, that's the amount of time that you have to give them some critical thinking skills, which in this business, whether you're on the street or whether you're in a facility working, as a correctional officer, critical thinking skills are massive. And you are going to use them many times a day, sometimes many times in an hour. Sometimes you may have to use critical thinking skills multiple times in a minute, so teaching those critical thinking skills and how to think and that whatever they come up with, there's going to be accountability for that. And we don't want to not encourage them to make a decision because there's accountability. We want them to encourage them to make the right decision and just simply be able to justify the decision that they made. I know I've been in situations throughout my career where I've had to make decisions and I made the decision and it turned out it was the wrong decision. But I was able to sit down and justify my actions and justify why I made that decision. And ultimately, even if there may have been some punishment that went along with it, it did. But I didn't lose the respect of my superiors, and I didn't lose the respect of my fellow staff members because I couldn't make a decision, or because I made a bad decision and then trying to cover that decision up. You use those critical thinking skills, make a decision, and then just be able to justify that decision. And I think if we could get instructors across the board to grasp that concept, I think we would really improve our state of training around the globe.
Yes, critical thinking, one of the most important parts of the job. And also, I guess, being able to handle stress is a big thing. And you mentioned it a little bit earlier. One aspect of training, would you say reality-based training is an essential ingredient to effective training program, a heightened stress within training? So, people up and coming have exposure to feelings in their body that they haven't maybe experienced in their life.
I would say that if you were running a training program today and you are not encompassing reality-based training into that program, that you are failing. Reality-based training is a massive part of the training. Not only do the students through reality-based training, they get to build these schemas in their head of what an attack would look like, what it feels like in real life, what it smells like, what it tastes like. I mean, they really get to live it. But what you also get to do through reality-based training is confirm that the initial training that you're doing is actually correct. If I'm teaching a specific skill set from a fundamental aspect of a defensive tactics, so to speak, or firearm skills, and then I'm noticing in reality-based training, no one's able to duplicate that skill, well, then that means that I'm not teaching it properly or I'm teaching the wrong thing. So I think reality-based training, not only is it just huge importance for the students that are going through the reality-based training, I think it's also important for a training program to be able to, confirm what you're doing and confirm if it's correct and whether you need to adapt it. And then I also think, many times when we talk about reality-based training, all people will focus on is the firearm skills or the defensive tactics skills. We use it for tactical casualty care. We use reality-based training, and we even incorporate report writing into our reality-based training. Meaning after as we go through our reality-based training, that training starts out small and it ends up with longer scenarios. But after that final scenario is over with, we'll ask the student to sit down. We want you to write a report that describes the events that happened, what you saw, what the suspect did, what you as an officer did, and then justify that use of force. So we're working on the report writing aspect of it. We're also going back to what I mentioned earlier. We're also focusing on that critical thinking skills and justification of your actions. So I think, like I said to begin with, if you're running a training program in any aspect and you're not incorporating reality-based training into it in some way, shape, or form, you need to catch up because you're behind right now.
How much do you draw on your own personal experience when designing an RBT scenario, or kind of what other experiences would you maybe draw from?
I draw quite a bit from my own experiences. I call it fortunate. Many people may not, but I've been fortunate that I've experienced a lot of real world situations in many different environments and very austere conditions. So I have a lot to draw from, but I'm not only drawing and looking at that scenario and setting it up based on my successes, I'm also basing it on when I reacted to a situation and I was wrong. And I realized, what, my initial reaction to this scenario was wrong, and I don't want people to duplicate that same thing. So we need to expose them to this, and we need to teach them the appropriate way to respond in this situation. But I also think it's important to draw from other people's experience as well, and overall study human behavior. I watch a lot of videos, a lot of body cam videos, dash cam videos, surveillance videos, and look for that human behavior of how did that person initially respond when this threat was presented to them, and build scenarios off of that. And I think that, it's important for people when you're building a scenario to not just look at it of, how did you react? How did Philip react in this specific event? But look at the empirical data of physiology. What is the body naturally going to do in this position that you're placed in? And I think you have to take that into account. And then I also think you need to look at the level of class you're teaching, as well as what the expected skill level of the students are showing up. If I'm doing scenario-based training for my special teams people, an emergency response team, that I'm not going to run the exact same scenario if I'm teaching a basic recruit academy. So even if it may be my personal experience that I drew it from, the outcome of that scenario may not necessarily be exactly what I did, even though it turned out okay for me. My level of training at the point in time in which that specific scenario happened may be a lot different than what the people I'm teaching is going to be. So I try to draw on a lot of different things. I try not to, it's not all about me, but I definitely draw from the experiences that I've had, whether it's in patrol as a canine handler, working undercover, dealing with people undercover, whatever that experience was, I try to draw on them and duplicate them to an extent, understanding that the correct response to that scenario may not necessarily be what I did.
Yeah, it's important to learn from, your successes and mistakes. What would you say are some potential pitfalls when observing RBT scenarios and maybe mistakes that you've realized, things that don't work in reality-based training or things that work best?
I would say first and foremost is when we as instructors or as role players allow our own egos to get involved in that scenario. I have seen scenario-based training where the bad guy refused to lose, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I think you have to be a good bad guy. And I think that's part of the training. When we do reality-based training, only our instructors are role players. We don't allow anybody from a class to come in and do a role play or just some extra body that we can come across. Only our instructors are role players. That is rehearsed. It is. We know exactly how it's going to go based on the student's reaction, and the role player knows exactly what their role is, and their role is to induce stress, and then also reward that role player for appropriate actions. And then the other thing I look at is, setting your students up for failure. That just can't happen. You can't just set them up for failure because nobody's learning anything, and they're going to end up walking out of that class with no confidence in their abilities. And I think the last thing we want is to send an officer back out to their beat lacking confidence in what they're capable of doing. And then I think there's a fine line between creating scenarios that take too long to evolve. If you walk into a scenario and it takes 30 minutes before anything actually happens, then you're just not maximizing your training time. Mm-hmm. So I think using some very quick scenarios is what I like to do. Do some really fast scenarios initially to get people through a lot of scenarios where it's very fast evolving, and then ends very quickly. But then at the same point in time, I think there should be times in that scenario that we should allow it to play out. Not that we don't want to take a long time to evolve into it, but once it starts, let it play out. I've been in reality-based training before as a student where once force was used, the scenario was over with. And I think that's fine for your flash type scenarios where it's really fast type stuff. But when you start getting into these others, and I think it's necessary to get into some of these others, to let it play out. So the student that's in the scenario, whether it's calling for backup, calling for emergency rescue, notifying a supervisor, and also allowing them and teaching them to de-escalate themselves after the force has been used. De-escalation is a big hot topic in our industry today, and we see those times that an officer is elevated, their heart rate goes up, all of a sudden they use force, and then once the resistance stops, the force at that point does not stop. And I think part of that comes directly back to our reality-based training, where we have to use that reality-based training to teach that officer how to de-escalate themselves and to monitor that de-escalation during the training and be able to address it. Then we look at the aspects of understanding that fundamental skills are not learned in reality-based training. Fundamental skills are learned through different processes, starting out doing it very static, step by step, learning the process, and then slowly evolving into more dynamic type techniques and doing them, at close to full speed or at full speed, depending on that specific tack that you're working on. And a couple of the people, I'll tell you, the couple of people that I have gone to their training and instructor classes that I've gone to, and both of them have been guests on your show, and that was Kelly Keith and Tony Blower.
Oh yeah.
Been to both of them, been to instructor level classes with both of those guys, and they do an absolutely outstanding job at teaching the technique, teaching the fundamentals, from a static up to dynamic, and then rolling that into role player, reality-based type training. And I try to mimic a lot of the stuff that I do based on what I learned from them, because I thought they did an absolutely outstanding job at it. And the other issue that I've seen, and I'll probably stop it there, is misusing training tools.
Right. Yeah.
Such as, I'm a big fan of the stress vest. We use it with our agency, and we use it in a lot of our reality-based training, because we're not limited by our environment. We can take that specific training tool and we can use it anywhere. And when you allow take a tool like that and you allow people to abuse it and let it become almost a child's game where it's all just about inflicting pain on each other, I think that's a disservice to the students. I think it's dangerous, and you're not maximizing your training time, and that's something that I'm really big on, is maximizing training time, because I think if we asked any officer listening, do you get enough training? Their response is going to be no, we don't get enough training, and I agree with that. None of us get enough training, and in my opinion, there's no such thing as enough. So allowing a quality training tool such as the stress vest, the shock knife, or whatever it is that we're using, allow it to become a child's game and not maximize your training time, and at the same point in time build training scars through that that a lot of people don't realize that they're building. I think it's dangerous, and I think it needs to really be focused on and not tolerated.
Right. And going on with advice for students, what piece of advice would you give to new law enforcement or correctional officers in relation to officer safety training? I know you mentioned a few things about critical thinking skills and not wasting your time or abusing the items. But what else would you say is good advice for new recruits?
I would say, if I had to give one piece of advice, and this is what I'm consistently telling new officers when I speak to them, you need to get in shape and stay in shape. It's you have to get in shape and stay in shape physically, but you also have to be in shape mentally, and you have to be in shape emotionally. And I think that overall, just getting in shape and staying in shape and understanding all aspects of your body and mental, physical, and emotional, where you're at, is really what it takes to have a long, productive career, and being able to come out of this career, and be able to enjoy the rest of your life once that time comes through retirement or whatever it may be.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's probably the one biggest piece of advice that I consistently give people, is take care of yourself, not just physically.
And if you could give one piece of advice to fellow officer safety trainers, what would that be?
That would be easy. Check your ego at the door. It's not about you.
Right.
Absolutely. That would be my biggest, and that's probably the biggest downfall that I have run into with training is when egos get involved, and there's just not room for it. It's not about you.
All right. Well, I think that's a great time to end it. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this interview. Philip Law, thanks so much.
John, I appreciate it. I appreciate the opportunity.
This has been the Prepared Warrior Podcast. For more info on our guests or other episodes, check out thepreparedwarrior.com. If you have any questions, comments, or ideas for the Prepared Warrior Podcast, email jon@thepreparedwarrior.com.